The observation concourse on Elix Station was designed to feel neutral. Neutral lighting, neutral colors, neutral architecture that belonged to no species in particular. A place meant to keep displaced lives orderly, calm, and forgettable. Serai Vireth preferred it during off-cycle hours. She always arrived when the crowd density dropped below 20%, after the trade envoys finished their meals, and before the night shift workers flooded in. At that hour, the concourse belonged to people who wanted to be alone, or who had learned that solitude was safer. Serai moved with quiet precision, her long silver-toned coat falling perfectly into place as she walked. No unnecessary gestures, no wasted motion. She collected her ration from the dispenser, nodded once to the automated system, and scanned the room with practiced efficiency. She chose a table near the viewport, not for the stars, for the sightlines. Old instincts never fully disappeared. They only learned how to hide. She sat with her back angled slightly toward the wall, one shoulder aligned so she could see both entrances without turning her head. Her tray was placed neatly, utensils parallel, data slate propped at an angle that blocked casual glances but allowed rapid access. The slate displayed administrative records, logistical reports from minor colonial disputes decades old. Safe work, boring work, the kind that kept her mind occupied without touching anything that still hurt. Around her, Elix Station breathed, soft footsteps, low conversation hums, the distant vibration of docking clamps releasing somewhere deep in the structure. Serai filtered it all into background noise, the way she had trained herself to do years ago. No one approached her table. They never did. People noticed her height, the faint luminescence beneath her skin, the elegant severity of her features, but they didn't engage. They gave her the careful courtesy reserved for complicated histories. A glance, a nod, distance, visible, unacknowledged, exactly as the station's unspoken rules dictated. Serai Vireth had once stood before planetary councils. She had spoken, and entire systems had listened. She had been groomed from early adolescence to command, to negotiate, to decide. Now she cataloged the failures of others. She told herself she preferred it this way. Isolation was clean, predictable. Invisibility carried fewer risks than relevance. She was halfway through her meal when the pressure doors hissed open. Sarai's gaze lifted automatically. A human entered, tall, broad-shouldered. Station security uniform, dark, functional, with the insignia of senior command marked cleanly at the collar. He paused just inside the threshold, not hesitating but observing, not scanning for threats, mapping people. Serai felt the subtle tightening in her chest she always did when attention lingered too long. The human collected his tray, then turned, and walked directly toward her table, her muscles tensed before she could stop them. People did not sit with her. They chose tables near friends, near colleagues, near safety. They did not voluntarily step into the gravitational field of someone everyone else avoided. The human stopped beside her chair. "Mind if I sit here?" His voice was calm, unforced, as if this were the most natural decision in the world. Serai stared at him. Up close, his expression was open but controlled, not curious in the invasive way, not cautious, simply present. "This table has the best sightlines," he added, gesturing lightly. "Most of the others are either too close to the vents or block peripheral visibility." Her first instinct was refusal. Preserve the boundary. Reinforce the pattern. Avoid complications. But he was already setting his tray down, moving with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to shared space, to saying "we" instead of "me." No objection. He asked, pausing just long enough to offer her the choice. Serai swallowed. "That's fine," she said, her voice slightly rough from disuse. "Please." He sat not too close, not distant, precisely measured. They ate in silence. And something unexpected happened. He didn't feel it. No small talk. No probing questions. No awkward attempts to justify his presence. He simply ate, posture relaxed, attention divided between his meal and the environment. Serai felt herself uncoil. After several minutes, he spoke, not to her history, not to her appearance, but to the data slate she was reading. "You're reviewing governance collapse models," he observed. "Archive classification, I assume." She looked at him sharply. Most people didn't even know what those files were. "Yes," she said slowly. "Administrative analysis." He nodded, genuinely interested. Alex must have an unusually rich data set. Exiles tend to arrive right after everything falls apart. "That's when records are most honest," Serai replied before she could stop herself. "Before narratives stabilize." He smiled, not broadly, not patronizingly. "Exactly." They looked at each other then, not as security chief and resident, not as human and alien, but as two minds recognizing the same pattern. "I'm Commander Elias Ward," he said. "Station security." Serai hesitated, then answered with the name she'd chosen to survive under. Serai. No title, no lineage, just the name. "Well," Elias said. Serai noticed the change before she could name it. It wasn't dramatic. Nothing in the concourse shifted visibly. The lights didn't dim. No alarm sounded. But the texture of the space altered, like a room where a door had quietly unlocked. People were looking again. Not staring. Not openly. Just recalibrating. A Cathari logistics officer 2 tables away glanced at Elias, then at Serai, then back to his meal with a fraction more attention than before. A pair of traders entering the concourse slowed their pace, eyes flicking briefly toward the viewport table before resuming their conversation. Information had begun to move. Elias finished eating at an unhurried pace. When he set his utensils down, he didn't stand immediately. He rested his forearms lightly on the table, posture open but contained. "You work the archives alone?" he asked. "Yes." No apology, no justification. "I thought so," he said. "Your access permissions are unusually broad." That made her pause. Most residents never noticed the invisible lines of authorization that governed Alex Station. Elias hadn't just seen them, he'd understood what they implied. "They're legacy clearances," Serai replied carefully. "Granted before my relocation." He nodded once, accepting the answer without pressing. "That kind of access usually belongs to people who were trusted with decision-making," he said. "Not just record-keeping." The words settled between them. Serai felt a familiar instinct rise, the reflex to deflect, to minimize, to redirect the conversation back into safe, impersonal territory. She'd practiced that maneuver for over a decade. "Decisions are only meaningful when you have authority to act on them," she said. "Archives don't require authority, only patience." Elias studied her for a moment. "You'd be surprised how many security failures start in archives," he said mildly. "People assume history is passive. It is. It teaches patterns, predicts pressure points." Sarai met his gaze. "Yes," she said softly, "it does." He smiled again, not because he'd won a point, but because she'd confirmed something he already suspected. They sat in silence for another minute. This time it felt different, less empty, less defensive. "I usually rotate meal locations," Elias said as he stood, collecting his tray. "Helps me understand resident behavior cycles." Sarai's chest tightened without permission. This had been a one-time interaction. That was how these things worked. A moment of anomaly before the universe corrected itself. "I eat here during off-cycle," she said, surprising herself with the admission. "Around this time." Elias paused, then inclined his head slightly. Not a promise, not a claim, good to know. He left with the same measured stride he'd arrived with. Serai remained seated long after he was gone, her data slate dark, her food untouched. Around her the concourse slowly returned to equilibrium. Conversations resumed. Foot traffic normalized. The anomaly was being absorbed, contextualized, categorized. But something inside her refused to settle. The next time Elias sat with her, it was not an accident. 3 days later, same hour, same table. This time, Serai noticed the deliberate way he chose the seat opposite her, angled so they both shared the viewport rather than facing one another directly. A subtle reduction of pressure. They spoke more. Not about themselves, about systems, about how empires justified emergency powers, about how revolutions rarely failed immediately but rotted quietly from the inside once fear replaced legitimacy, about how people mistook control for stability until the two became indistinguishable. Elias asked questions that assumed competence. Serai answered without simplifying. And each time she did, something old stirred, an ease she hadn't felt since council chambers and policy briefings and late-night strategic debates that once mattered. After their fourth shared meal, an administrator noticed. Administrator Kellen Thor, a tall, slate-skinned T-lesion with diplomatic implants lining his temple, requested a brief meeting with the new security commander. "Your integration strategy is effective," Thor said, folding his hands. "But I want to address a potential sensitivity." Elias remained standing, neutral, alert. "Resident Serai Vireth," Thor continued. "You've established a visible association." "I have conversations with residents," Elias replied. "That's part of my mandate. This resident is politically delicate." Elias waited. Thor activated a private display. Layers of redacted data unfolded, then resolved into older records, ones most staff never accessed. Serai Vireth. Formerly, Serai Vireth Aurelian. Heir designate to a dissolved interstellar authority whose collapse had been carefully rewritten by its successors. "She officially does not exist," Thor said quietly. "Acknowledging her competence complicates narratives several governments depend on." Elias felt something cold and precise settle into place. "So the protocol," he said, "is erasure by neglect." "Discretion," Thor corrected gently. "Silence, distance, polite absence." Elias met his gaze. "No," he said evenly, "that's erasure." Thor sighed. "Commander, Elix survives because we do not provoke powers larger than ourselves." Elias thought of the quiet table, the parallel utensils, the way Serai had spoken about collapse with clarity sharpened by lived experience. "I won't pretend someone is lesser because their existence is inconvenient," he said. "I'll be discreet. I won't be complicit." Thor studied him for a long moment. "Be careful," he said finally. "Visibility changes gravity." Serai felt the gravity shift the following week. People greeted her, tentatively, carefully, as if recalculating how much space she occupied. A former trade delegate asked her opinion on a stalled negotiation in passing. A systems analyst lingered too long at a corridor junction, then asked if she'd reviewed Serai tried to pull back. Not abruptly, not obviously. She simply adjusted, arrived a little later, chose different routes through the station, shortened conversations that lingered too long. Old survival instincts reasserting themselves. Visibility had a cost. She felt it in the way people now paused when she spoke, in how questions were framed more carefully, in the subtle recalibration of respect that came with recognition. Recognition was dangerous. Elix Station tolerated many things, but destabilizing narratives were not among them. She was reviewing transport logs in the archive wing when the first direct pressure arrived. "Serai Vireth," a voice said behind her. Polite. Controlled, administrative, she turned. Two station liaisons stood at a respectful distance, one human, one Telvari, neutral uniforms, diplomatic insignia, not security, not enforcement. "Administrator Thor has requested a brief conversation," the Telvari said. "At your convenience." Serai felt the old tightening in her chest. Of course he had. She followed them through corridors she'd walked 1,000 times, now suddenly aware of how many cameras tracked her movement, how many systems logged proximity and association. Thor's office was exactly as she remembered from orientation years ago, carefully impersonal, designed to project fairness while revealing nothing. "Please," Thor said, gesturing to a seat. "Thank you for coming." Serai remained standing. "I prefer to keep this brief," she said calmly. Thor inclined his head. "As do I." He folded his hands. "Your recent activities have drawn attention." "I catalog archives and eat meals," Serai replied. Neither violates station protocol. No, Thor agreed, but patterns do. She met his gaze evenly. You were assigned invisibility, he said. Not as punishment, as protection. Certain governments require narratives to remain stable. Your renewed presence introduces variables. I have not made claims, Serai said. I have not issued statements or sought influence. Influence does not require intention, Thor replied. It requires perception. Silence stretched between them. Commander Ward has declined to alter his conduct, Thor added carefully, which places responsibility on you. There it was, the quiet offer returned to obscurity and the pressure would ease. Sarai felt something unfamiliar rise beneath her composure. Not anger, clarity. You're asking me to disappear again, she said. Not because I've done harm, but because my competence makes other people uncomfortable. Thor didn't deny it. I'm asking you to consider the station's stability, he said, and your own safety. Sarai thought of the archive rooms, of 12 years spent shrinking herself into something harmless, of how easily that erasure had been justified as mercy. I survived invisibility, she said, but I won't pretend it was protection. She stood. If you intend to restrict my activities, document it formally, she continued. Otherwise, I will continue operating within the boundaries of station law. Thor studied her for a long moment. Visibility attracts attention, he said quietly. Not all of it benevolent. So does silence, Sarai replied. It just kills more slowly. She found Elias that evening in the observation corridor, overlooking the docking ring. He was leaning against the railing, hands loose at his sides, gaze fixed on the slow ballet of arriving vessels. They spoke to you, he said without turning. Yes. He exhaled slowly. I was warned, he admitted, told to exercise discretion. Sarai joined him at the railing, their shoulders aligned but not touching. I'm considering stepping back, she said. Not because I think they're right, but because the consequences may not fall only on me. Elias turned to her then. Do you want to step back? He asked. The question landed with quiet force. Sarai searched herself for the familiar instinct to retreat. It wasn't there. No, she said. I want to stand still and let the world adjust. A small smile touched his mouth. Not approval, respect. Then you won't be standing alone, he said. She looked at him, truly looked this time. Not as a symbol, not as an anomaly, but as a man making a conscious choice. Why, she asked, why risk complication for me? Elias considered the stars beyond the viewport. Because systems that require people to vanish to function deserve to be questioned, he said. And because pretending you don't matter would make me complicit in something I don't accept. The word complicit echoed. Sarai felt something settle inside her, heavy, grounding, decision. The following days brought escalation. A former planetary governor sought her counsel openly, then another, then a third. Conversations moved from corridors to reserved rooms, from abstract theory to applied frameworks. Sarai found herself doing what she had once been trained to do: listen, analyze, synthesize. She was careful, no declarations, no allegiance, no claims, just competence. That, she was learning, was enough to be dangerous. Whispers began circulating through exile networks, not of restoration, but of alternatives, of someone who understood failure without romanticizing the past. Elias watched the station respond. Security metrics shifted. Social clusters reorganized. Influence vectors realigned. And somewhere far beyond Alex Station, in places that pretended Serai Vireth did not exist, attention began to turn. Serai felt it. The sense of standing at the edge of something that could no longer be undone. She did not know where it would lead, but she knew, with certainty, that stepping back now, the request arrived through official channels. That alone made it different. Sarai was in the archive wing when her console chimed. Priority routing, diplomatic clearance layered with asylum protocol overrides. The message header displayed no government seal, no faction identifier. Only a designation, civilian delegation, MARTHIAN space. Her fingers hovered above the interface. For 11 years, nothing from Marthian space had carried her name. She opened it. Administrator Thor requested her presence in Conference Chamber C within the hour. No explanation, no warning language, just procedure. Elias was already there when she arrived. Not seated at the table, standing near the wall, arms loose, posture alert but deliberately non-threatening. Security presence but restrained. A signal to everyone else in the room that whatever was about to happen mattered. The chamber itself was neutral, circular, designed for discussions that should not feel like trials or endorsements. 3 figures waited at the far side of the table. They were not soldiers. That was the first thing Serai noticed. No uniforms, no insignia, no weapons visible or concealed. An older woman stood at the center, posture straight despite the years etched into her face. Her hair was bound in a traditional Marthian-style Serai hadn't seen in over a decade. On either side of her stood a man in civilian scholar's robes and a younger woman wearing the subtle symbols of one of Marthia's old faith orders. Civilians. The older woman inclined her head. "Serai Vireth," she said. "Thank you for agreeing to meet us." Serai did not correct the name. "You requested audience," Serai replied evenly. "You have it." The woman's eyes softened, not with pity but recognition. "My name is Tareth," she said. "I served in the administrative corps during the final years of the old government. Low level, easily forgotten." Serai doubted that. People like this were never forgotten by those who mattered. "We come without authority," Tareth continued. "Without military backing, without promises we cannot keep." Serai folded her hands. "Then speak plainly." The younger woman stepped forward. "The collective is fracturing," she said. "Not in rumors, in fact. Regional commands are ignoring central directives. Supply chains are failing. Civil protections have collapsed in several sectors." Serai had seen the data. The patterns were unmistakable. Tareth continued. "For years, they told our people the monarchy was corrupt, that its removal was necessary for survival. Some believed it, many did not." She met Serai's gaze directly. "But now the alternative is visible." Silence filled the chamber. "You are not here to restore an empire," Serai said. "If you were, you wouldn't have survived the journey." A faint smile touched Tareth's lips. "No," she said. "We are here because collapse creates space, and space demands something to fill it." The scholar spoke next. "Our people are afraid of chaos, afraid of endless military rule, afraid of repeating the past under a different banner." Serai felt the weight of the room settle onto her shoulders. "And you believe I am that something," she said quietly. "We believe you could be," Tareth replied. "Not as ruler, not as symbol of the past, but as continuity, as someone who understands why the old system failed, and how to avoid building the same failure again." Serai's chest tightened. "I have no army," she said, "no claim recognized by force." "Neither do we," Tareth answered. "What we have is need. Need, not flattery, not fantasy. The most dangerous word of all." Elias shifted subtly at the wall, not interrupting but present. A reminder that Serai was not facing this alone. Serai stood. "You are asking me to prepare," she said. "Not to act, not yet." "Yes," Tareth said, "to be ready. To help us design something viable if, and when the moment comes." Serai looked from face to face. She saw exhaustion, resolve, fear held in check by discipline. These were not revolutionaries chasing myth. They were people running out of time. "I will not promise success," Serai said. "I will not promise restoration. I will not return to Marthian space unless conditions allow for civilian transition without immediate bloodshed." Tareth bowed her head. "That is all we hope to hear." Serai closed her eyes briefly. For 11 years, survival had been enough. It no longer was. "I will prepare," she said, quietly, carefully, and without spectacle. Elias exhaled, slow, controlled. The delegation rose. When they left, the chamber felt suddenly too large. Serai remained standing, staring at the table as if it were a map she hadn't yet learned to read. "This changes things," Elias said softly. "Yes," she replied. There's no returning to invisibility now. He stepped closer, not touching, but near enough that she could feel the steadiness. Preparation did not announce itself. It arrived quietly, disguised as work. Serai structured it that way on purpose. No public meetings, no declarations, no symbols that could be misread as claims. Everything documented, procedural, deniable if necessary. She framed her involvement not as leadership, but as analysis support. The same thing she had already been doing on Alex Station, only now with direction. Frameworks first. She reopened models she hadn't touched in years, transitional governance structures, civilian oversight mechanisms, legitimacy transfer without violent enforcement. She cross-referenced failed restorations and successful transitions, isolating variables that mattered more than ideology. Food security, information trust, local authority continuity. At night, when the station dimmed into artificial quiet, she worked from her quarters, data slate balanced on her knees, old instincts guiding her thoughts with surprising clarity. She had not forgotten how to do this. She had simply been told for a very long time that she shouldn't. Elias checked in without intruding. Sometimes he brought questions, security implications of civilian councils, risks of power vacuums. Sometimes he brought silence and sat nearby while she worked, reading his own reports, sharing space without demanding attention. It grounded her. The first cost came sooner than she expected. Administrator Thor summoned her again, this time without pretense of neutrality. "You're receiving off-station communications at an increased frequency," he said. "Encrypted, patterned, civilian source but politically sensitive." Serai didn't deny it. "I am advising," she said, "not organizing." "The distinction matters less to external observers," Thor replied. "The collective has noticed." Serai met his gaze calmly. They were going to notice eventually. Thor's expression tightened. "You're endangering your asylum status." "I am operating within station law," she said evenly. "If that changes, inform me formally." Thor studied her for a long moment. "You've changed," he said. "Yes," Serai replied, "I have." He dismissed her with a sigh that carried equal parts frustration and reluctant respect. The second cost was personal. Elias was called into a closed review session with Dominion oversight 3 days later. He told her afterward, not with drama, but with honesty. "They asked whether my judgment has been compromised," he said. "Whether I've allowed personal attachment to influence station security posture." Sarai felt a sharp, unwelcome twist in her chest, and, she asked. "I told them my judgment has been clarified," he said, "not compromised." She looked at him, truly looked at him. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I did," he replied simply. Silence stretched between them. For the first time since this began, Serai felt the full weight of consequence. Not abstract, not theoretical, but immediate and shared. This wasn't just her risk anymore. "I won't let this cost you your position," she said quietly. Elias shook his head. "You don't get to decide what risks I'm willing to take," he said gently, "any more than I get to decide yours." Something softened between them then, not romance, not obligation, mutual choice. The final cost came without warning. An emergency transmission arrived from Marthian space, not encrypted, not subtle, public. Civil unrest had tipped into open conflict. Military factions were seizing infrastructure. Civilian councils were collapsing under pressure. Refugee movements had begun. The window for preparation was closing. Sarai stood in her quarters, message replaying on loop, the familiar tightening in her chest now sharpened into something colder and clearer. This was the moment she had prepared for, not the triumph, the necessity. Elias arrived minutes later. He didn't ask questions, he just stood with her as the message ended. "They'll ask you to come," he said. "Yes. And if you do." "They'll still try," Sarai replied, "just without preparation." She turned to him. "I can stay," she said. "Continue advising from here. Remain protected, useful, alive. And if you go." "I might fail," she said. "I might make things worse. I might not come back." Elias nodded. Then he said, "What would you regret more?" Serai didn't hesitate, not trying. Decision settled into place, not dramatic, not emotional, inevitable. "I'll leave," she said. "Not as ruler, not as savior, as civilian authority with prepared frameworks and conditional legitimacy." Elias let out. The departure was not ceremonial. There were no banners, no announcements broadcast across Elix Station, no official endorsement that might be interpreted as legitimacy or defiance. But people noticed anyway. They always did when something real was happening. Serai moved through the corridors with measured calm, carrying only what she needed: data cores containing governance frameworks, civilian coordination protocols, risk assessments refined through months of quiet preparation. No relics, no symbols of the past, nothing that tied her to what had already failed. She was not returning as what she had been. She was leaving as what she had become. Administrator Thor met her at the docking concourse, expression composed, eyes tired. "I will not pretend this doesn't complicate matters," he said. "But I also won't pretend you're wrong." Serai inclined her head. "Thank you for not stopping me." Thor exhaled. Some narratives deserve to be disrupted. The transport vessel waited beyond the viewport, civilian class, unarmed, deliberately unremarkable. A choice made for survival, not spectacle. Elias walked beside her, not ahead, not behind, beside. At the airlock they stopped. For a moment neither spoke. "This is where I stop being useful," Elias said quietly. Serai turned to face him. "No," she said. "This is where what you did becomes permanent." He frowned slightly. "You sat with me," she continued, "when it was easier not to. You treated me like I mattered when the station had learned to forget me. Everything after that exists because of that choice." Elias held her gaze, something unguarded in his expression now. "I didn't make you who you are," he said. "No," Serai agreed, "but you reminded me." They stood there close enough that the space between them felt intentional. Then Serai did something she had not planned. She reached for him. Not desperately, not hesitantly. She embraced him, brief, steady, grounding. A thank you without words. Elias returned it just as simply. "When this is over," he said softly, "whatever that looks like, you'll have a place here." Serai stepped back, eyes bright but steady. "Then I'll make sure there's a reason to return." She entered the airlock. The doors sealed. The transport disengaged. Through the viewport, Elix Station receded, sanctuary, prison, birthplace of a second life. Serai watched until it became a distant lattice of light against the dark. She felt fear. She felt resolve. She felt the weight of people who would never know her name but would live with the consequences of her choices. And beneath all of it, something she had not allowed herself to feel in years: dignity. Marthian space was chaos when she arrived. Not the dramatic kind, no single explosion or decisive battle, but fragmentation. Power fractured into pieces too small to govern and too large to ignore. Civilian councils struggled to feed populations. Military factions postured without consensus. Trust was a scarce resource. Serai did not claim authority. She offered structure. She met with civilian leaders first, listened before speaking, presented frameworks instead of demands, conditional pathways instead of promises. Some rejected her outright. Some hesitated. Some recognized what she was offering: not a return to monarchy, not a continuation of military rule, but a bridge. Slowly, cautiously, the bridge held. Weeks passed, then months. The work was brutal, exhausting, unforgiving, but it was real. Back on Elix Station, Elias watched the reports with careful neutrality. Civilian stabilization zones established. Supply chains restored in limited sectors. Provisional councils formed with oversight mechanisms that actually functioned. It wasn't victory, but it wasn't collapse. And that mattered. One evening, long after off-cycle hours had emptied the concourse, Elias sat alone at the familiar table near the viewport. For the first time, it felt empty. Then his console chimed. A single message, unencrypted, still standing, still building. "Serai." He smiled. Serai stood on a balcony overlooking a city that had not burned, not rebuilt, not healed, but breathing. She rested her hands on the railing, feeling the cool metal beneath her palms. She was not a queen. She did not need to be. She had learned that worth did not come from titles, bloodlines, or the permission of systems that benefited from erasure. It came from choosing to stand when it was easier to vanish, from being seen, and then choosing to see others in return. Once, a human had sat beside her in a the first true test came quietly, not with gunfire or declarations, but with disagreement. 3 regional councils convened on the same cycle, each claiming provisional authority over overlapping civilian zones. None possessed enough legitimacy to overrule the others. All feared that compromise would be interpreted as weakness. Serai listened. She let them speak past one another until exhaustion thinned the sharpest edges of certainty. Only then did she ask a single question. Which of you can guarantee food delivery for the next 48 hours? Silence followed, not because they were unprepared, but because the question reframed the conflict. Power debates were abstract. Hunger was not. Within hours, a temporary coordination compact was drafted. Not elegant, not permanent, but sufficient. The councils agreed to share logistics authority under strict time limits, reviewed daily, audited publicly. It wasn't unity, it was restraint. And in post-collapse space, restraint was revolutionary. Serai noted the pattern forming. People didn't need a ruler. They needed someone who refused to let ideology outrun reality. Weeks later, she stood before a civilian assembly for the first time. No banners, no elevated platform. She remained on the same level as everyone else. I am not here to replace one form of control with another, she said. If at any point you believe this process no longer serves you, dismantle it. Systems that cannot survive scrutiny do not deserve permanence. Some looked skeptical, others looked relieved. That reaction told her everything. Elias received the first classified assessment 3 months after her departure. Stability Index, improving. Civilian trust metrics, low but rising. Violence projection, reduced in monitored sectors. He reread the report twice, not because it was unbelievable, but because it was rare. In his experience, post-collapse zones usually chose extremes, authoritarian consolidation or total fragmentation. What Serai was building occupied a narrow, difficult middle, and it was working. Serai felt the strain. Leadership without force demanded constant presence, constant listening, constant recalibration. Every decision required justification not through command, but through coherence. Some nights she barely slept. Some days she wondered if she had mistaken endurance for strength. But then she would walk through a market that was open again. Hear children arguing about nothing important. See arguments resolved with words instead of weapons, and the doubt would loosen its grip. The message she sent Elias that night was longer. We're forming a transitional charter council. Civilian majority, oversight baked in, it's fragile but it's honest. He replied within minutes. Honest is harder to kill than fragile. She smiled at that. Not everyone approved. Remnants of the collective attempted to discredit her publicly. Old propaganda resurfaced. Accusations of imperial nostalgia, of manipulation, of inevitability disguised as choice. Serai responded once, only once. Judge this process by its outcomes, she said in a recorded statement. Not by my past. If it fails, replace it. If it succeeds, improve it. Authority that cannot be challenged has already failed. The attacks faded, not because they were disproven, but because they were irrelevant. 6 months after her arrival, Serai stood alone on the same balcony, watching evening lights flicker on across the city. Still imperfect, still tense, but alive. She thought of Alex Station, of a quiet table, of a human who had chosen to sit beside her when it mattered. Not because he had to, but because he could. And that, she realized, was the truest foundation she had built everything on. The invitation came a year later, not urgent, not encrypted, not wrapped in crisis language, just a simple transmission routed through civilian channels. Alex Station requests your presence. Advisory consultation. Optional. Serai read it twice. Then once more. The city behind her hummed with evening life, markets closing, lights dimming, voices overlapping in the gentle disorder of people who expected tomorrow to come. It wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was standing. She had not become a ruler, she had become a reference point. And that, she had learned, was often more powerful. Alex Station looked smaller than she remembered, or perhaps she had grown. The corridors were the same, neutral, careful, balanced between species and histories that preferred not to collide. But as Serai walked through them, people did not look away. Some nodded, some paused. Some simply watched, not with fear or reverence but recognition. She felt no urge to shrink. The concourse was quiet, off-cycle hours, 15% occupancy. The same table near the viewport was empty. Serai chose it deliberately. She sat, aligned her posture, waited. Minutes passed. Then the pressure doors hissed open. Elias entered, older perhaps, not in years but in weight carried and released. His uniform was different now, less formal. Advisory insignia instead of command. He saw her immediately, of course he did. He crossed the concourse without hesitation. "Mind if I sit here?" he asked, the same calm in his voice. Serai smiled. "I was hoping you would." He sat. Not too close, not distant, perfectly measured. For a moment they simply looked out at the stars. "You built something," Elias said finally. "We built something," Serai corrected. "You just started it without knowing." He shook his head lightly. "I just chose a chair. And that," she said softly, "changed my life." Silence settled, comfortable, earned. No speeches, no summaries, just understanding. Later, as they stood to leave, Elias asked the question he had held back all evening. "Will you stay?" Serai considered it, then answered honestly. "For a while," she said. "I don't need to disappear anymore. But I don't need to stay away either." He nodded. That was enough. That night the concourse returned to its quiet rhythm. People ate, walked, lived. And at one small table near a viewport, two people sat, not as symbols, not as saviors, not as forgotten remnants of collapsed systems, but as equals, seen, choosing to see each other in return. And somewhere, carried through station networks and half-heard conversations, the story began to circulate, not as legend, not as propaganda, but as something quieter and more dangerous. That dignity could be restored. That worth was not granted by power. That sometimes, all it took to change everything was one person who refused to look away. And a